Please welcome to the stage, Nikki Batchelor.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope I don't put anybody to sleep for your nap time, but here we go. We're going to run through some interesting findings recently from the XPRIZE carbon removal. For those of you who I haven't met yet, I'm Nikki Batchelor. I run the XPRIZE carbon removal. It's a $100 million competition to accelerate carbon removal across all pathways. Today, obviously, we're focusing on DAC, so I wanted to bring some of the interesting insights and data from the report that we just released a few weeks ago to this group to put this back out into the ecosystem. A number of you who are competing in the prize have also contributed to this data through all of the interesting answers you've given us from the last submission. And just to give everyone a sense of where we're at in the timeline, we are about a little past halfway in the 4-year prize, and we'll be selecting our 20 finalists in a few months. So anybody who is still looking to advance in the competition, February 1st is the deadline. Just a quick PSA on that. And we'll be announcing the 20 finalists next Earth Day in April. And from there, we'll work very closely with that cohort over the next 12 months, and we'll be announcing the final winners of the competition in 2025. So with that, some of the findings that we recently received from closing registration. So technically it is now officially closed. We didn't do an early close of being able to join the competition like we have in past prizes because this industry is moving so quickly, as evidenced by everyone in this room here today. This would not have existed several years ago, so it's really amazing to see the growth and progress in such a short time. But the top line here is we had over 1,300 teams, we call them, but companies, startups, research initiatives, the full range of maturity there, raise their hand to say they wanted to participate in the competition. It's an interesting number to see how large that community has really grown, but the number that is more important for us to focus on is the number next to it, this 333 active teams. These are folks that said that they were interested in, or working towards, I should say, in a more serious, committed way, building a 1,000-ton demonstration project next year. That is the goal of the prize. We were trying to field as many demonstrations as possible to accelerate those technology development timelines. And this is the breakdown across the CDR pathways that we have loosely defined as air, rocks, ocean, land. So we're going to focus on the air data today. And that, in case you can't see that number, is 107 companies in the air track that have, said they're really working towards that goal. And what I want to show you is kind of the breakdown of who those folks are. I think we know some of these things anecdotally. You see it in your work. You know it from your colleagues, your competitors, other people who are working in the space. But it's nice to have some of the data in front of you to really see what the numbers ended up being. So obviously there has been a massive growth. This is just looking at the air companies here. So 51% of companies said they have been founded since 2021, and 76% founded since 2019. So it truly is a new growing industry, and you can see all of those folks who are working in this room right now. I want to give you a sense of the scale trajectory because everyone who's competing in the prize is technically working towards that goal, but we know that in the cohort of 300 companies here, 100 DAC companies, those folks are also on a range of scales. So around 60 companies are in this 100-ton to 1,000-ton projected range, and this is really the projection for 2024 because that's the demonstration window for the XPRIZE. So I just want to make that clear. A lot of this information is really like where folks are planning to be next year. You do have a good number of people that are in that 0 to 100 range, around 25, and then a few people who are beyond that. You see a similar spread across all of the tracks as well, if you just see the dot breakdown there. And then, interestingly, the overall planned removal capacity for 2024 shows up to be just about 4 megatons, which was very fascinating to see. We'll see where we end up. These are all self-reported projection numbers, and you can see the lighter blue dot is the air track there at the top, 441. And just to give you a sense of what do these companies look like, a few of the quick stats here. As far as commercial stage, the air companies, many of them are still in this R&D, pre-commercial pilot phase, early commercial. Some people are getting into that with their deployments next year. Very few people are in the growth stage, mature stage, which is to no shock for anyone in this room. Capital raised to date, this was also kind of interesting to see. I mean, because there are so many new companies that we're seeing coming in, this number is quite large for the under 1 million, and slowly grows from there. But I'll speak to some of the other kind of fundraising stats in a little bit, which you'll see how many people are actively fundraising in the space right now. Revenue ranges, also that makes sense with the numbers we just saw. Most are pre-revenue and under 1 million. And we'll also talk in a minute here about some of the interesting breakdowns of where that revenue is coming from. Number of employees, most companies are under 10 people still. We have, growing number, getting close to 20% between the 11 to 50. It's been interesting in a lot of my conversations with companies working in this space to see how a few folks are really rapidly starting to grow, what all the challenges are with growing, bringing on your first, head of people, head of HR, trying to keep the company culture. So this is a phase that many DAC companies are going to start to get into, going outside of that first founding team. TRL numbers we'll look at here. So the goal for the XPRIZE carbon removal is really in this TRL kind of 6 to 8 range. And, we see a lot of companies that self-proclaim to be in that area. I mean, TRL can be tricky. People definitely define it differently sometimes. But we do see DAC companies across all of the different TRL levels here, which to the point that was just made in that video presentation about really needing to be encouraging innovation across the full level of maturity set here, because we need new innovation to be coming into the space to help bring down costs and move the space forward. And then as new folks start deploying for the first time, being able to bring in learnings from companies that are just spinning out of university and research efforts for the first time. We do break down beyond just the high-level 4 tracks, which are really just kind of an organizing principle for us. We know that it doesn't solve for everything, and there's a lot of nuance here. We ask companies to share what their primary track is. So those are the 107 companies that selected air. And then they can also select a secondary track. So there's a lot of interesting hybrid approaches that are starting to come out. And we have some data that we included in the report there. This includes everybody who selected a primary or secondary. So you start to get other pathways to come on the map here. And if you look at just the most common mashups, I don't think there's any surprise on a few of these, but it is interesting to see what the counts are in each of the different categories. I'm not going to dwell on this. You guys can access all of this information for folks that are interested in the report. But all of the DAC companies that are looking for their matches with mineralization solutions, and some interesting other combos as folks start to get more creative with how they might think about DAC. And then this is the kind of 4 primary sub-tracks within the air pathway: solvent-based, solid sorbent, electrochemical, membrane-based. So you'll see the breakdown here. I mean, we really do cover the full range here of TRLs by tracks, but loosely you have some higher concentration in the earlier stages for membrane, and a little more maturity in the electrochemical space, but it is pretty spread, so I'm not sure you can draw any significant conclusions there at this moment. Revenue models. Okay, so I said we'll talk about this here. This is the breakdown first for the full 300 cohort. We were a little surprised to see how many people said they were making products. I don't know if this is surprising to folks here, but I've had a few other reactions similar to people being surprised here. And if you look at it by track, 73% of companies within the DAC space said that they were looking to make products. And you can see the breakdown towards the bottom here: advanced materials, building materials, industrial gases being the primary answers for folks who selected that. If we go back here, and then the number of folks who are selling credits, 24 just doing that. And then, oh no, we have it here. This is the bigger breakdown. So I looked it up specifically for this. It showed that 14 air teams have sold credits to date. So that was also kind of interesting to see. And you have some of the bigger projected numbers here of how much has been sold, how much is outstanding, how much has actually been removed to date. These numbers are going to change dramatically in the next few years. I'm sure we're all kind of interested to see how that evolves. And then, one of the main focuses of the XPRIZE, but of also the report that we released, was thinking about, like, what are the top areas of innovation that people are working on? So can we draw any conclusions across the cohort based on each of the tracks? So surprising to us, the answers were pretty consistent across all 4 tracks. Maybe that's not surprising because some of them are a bit general, but scalability, cost reduction, core performance, modularity, and products and co-benefits actually were the top 5 in all of the 4 tracks. So this is specifically the air breakdown. So you'll see things like sequestration rise, to the top here, sorbent catalysts, balance of plant, sustainable feedstock. So it's interesting to see that this is where folks are really trying to make improvements and put a lot of their energy into, their key competitive advantage. And, many people are working on the same things. Obviously, cost is a huge thing for DAC, so we know that cost and energy that goes hand in hand are 2 main areas. But there was some discussion earlier today about modularity and the role there. So I think, we'll see how many DAC solutions end up taking that approach. But this was kind of the quick highlight of what people self-reported. We also asked folks who were, what methodologies they were looking at in their work. And so I just showed a quick highlight of the people who said they are not referencing one specifically. We know that this is a big area moving forward as we start to see the maturity of the industry, but 85% of the DAC companies did not reference anything, which, for folks working on that, I'm sure is not surprising as well. And we also really wanted to get at what barriers were people facing. So we asked both about key barriers and missing capabilities. Definitely a lot of overlap in those answers, but you'll see here that funding was number 1, and that was true across all of the 4 pathways as well. And MRV came second as a missing key capability. I was a little surprised to see that marketing was number 3, to be honest. But if you think about, the messaging challenge, both to the broader public, to key stakeholders, to trying to educate buyers, it makes sense. And so I think marketing is also interpreted in a slightly broader way that probably includes sales and, all of those conversations to really get buyers of credits to be on board and understand the different solutions in the carbon removal landscape. Permitting, that's also come up quite a bit today, shouldn't be a surprise. And then the rest of these are pretty close, so I'm not going to go deeper into them. Fundraising, just to give you a little more color there, 77% of the 330 companies said they were fundraising. That is a lot of companies raising money right now, and from the same similar investment pool. So I think that this is a huge point for the space to be, continuing to think about what are all the different sources of capital. I was just at Carbon Unbound Europe moderating a session with a bunch of partners of VC firms, and it was interesting to hear their perspective on this as well. And we had an interesting debate around where the kind of gaps might be, and people seem to think that there's a lot of money available at kind of the seed and Series A stage, and then Series B we see a big drop off. And the question was that because companies aren't ready for it yet, or is that because the capital doesn't exist yet? There was also some interesting discussion around what are creative debt financing models that people can be exploring, and other people are trying to think about this too. So it's not all on you as founders to be figuring this out at the moment. There is definitely interest in trying to figure it out together, but it is a huge barrier. And we see that here. There's a breakdown of the active deals for the air teams that are fundraising. Currently 73 active deals and then the breakdown of deal sizes, 50, I'll just call out that one because it's big, in the 0 to 1 million range. And then, that corresponds with these stages. I think that is about my cue to wrap up the presentation, and we'll transition here to a discussion. But if you guys want any more information about deals, we track all of this in granular detail on the Circular Carbon Network website, and you can post your details about your active deals, and we'll share that with investors who are in that network too. So thank you guys for the time.
Thank you, Nikki. Please welcome to the stage Andy Uhler for a moderated discussion.
Are we good? There we go. Perfect. Sorry about that, y'all. So like I was saying, I'm just going to keep this light. We're about 20 minutes from happy hour. But I wanted to get a sense from you, Nikki, your involvement or how you got into this space. You have sort of a traditional business background. I was joking with some folks about being in this room and sort of having to start to understand exactly the nomenclature and sort of the things that are being talked about here. I'm curious, just your entry into the space and that sort of growth and where that came from.
Yeah, I joined XPRIZE about 8 years ago when we launched the first Carbon XPRIZE that was focused on the utilization space. Before that, I was focusing on designing innovation programs as well for USAID from the government context, and so thinking about what does it look like to put incentive structures out there in a way that kind of put a goal and can help to accelerate the technology development life cycle. So I came to it more from the broader perspective, and now that I've been working in climate for almost a decade, it's been fascinating to see the growth, but I think, carbon in particular has such a complex, market nature with everything that we're seeing and
Sure.
the growth of the space. So, I kind of got here in an unconventional path, but, I think I'm sticking around.
You were talking about, I think it's super interesting, sort of pointing out some of the needs in things like marketing when you're talking about this space. Mm-hmm. Brian DeMarco made a comment this morning about, he's from JP Morgan Chase, and he was talking about, people in this room, when you're talking about the technology, when you're talking about DAC, there's a lot of nodding and there's sort of an understanding of exactly what's happening. He said if you walked outside and you asked somebody walking down the street if they had any idea of what DAC was or direct air capture was, you're probably going to get a lot of no's. I'm curious from y'all's perspective, sort of the need to help that marketing strategy, but also educate. I do a lot of this in my work, sort of the education of folks and just getting them, to a space where we can have a conversation, right?
Mm-hmm. We talk a lot about this at XPRIZE. It's one of the areas that we try and use a prize to kind of make momentum and just general understanding and awareness of an issue, and then trying to, focus the, scientists and technologists to work on a space. But there is value in the kind of broader public awareness messaging, and every time we put something out into the world about the prize, it's like, who is the audience? Is it the general audience? Is it your grandmother? Is it the climate community? Is it CDR specialists? Because all of those are different and they all have a varying degree of understanding of the space. I think that they're all important and they all have very different strategies to reach them. So oftentimes it's, this piece is for people who understand the space, and this piece is for, a new entrant. And what does it take to bring the world along with the growth of the industry? Like, we're only 3 years now, into having all of these people in the room. It's still, we're still educating people who understand things about carbon and climate. And I think the next wave is really trying to bring that education gap out into the broader world. And we're seeing, DOE running into that when,
Sure.
Putting out calls, and we're seeing more, community groups starting to get become part of the conversation because, people know that it's happening now. It's not just an idea. There are real demonstrations and deployments and large sums of money going out the door. So now people are like, oh, I guess I need to learn about that. But there's a lot of fear associated with it. So I think one of the reasons that it's important to focus on broader marketing efforts is because people need to not be scared of this new thing, the unknown. So there's definitely a role for the ecosystem to play.
And you mentioned this too, and I think it's a really good point, educating policymakers, educating those folks who are thinking about regulation and things like that. And I know 45Q gets squishy, and I know I'm curious about sort of the working in concert with government, but at the same time, kind of filling a gap, where there isn't necessarily funding for one technology or one sort of idea. XPRIZE can fill that gap. I'm curious about those conversations y'all are having.
Yeah, so we designed this prize back in 2018. It was a lonely, small community then, I will say. And, if we were to do it now, I'm not sure it would be needed in the same way. I'm not saying that the space has, solved itself here, but the incredible momentum that, DOE is making and putting out new funding announcements and putting effort into this space is huge. A lot of times XPRIZE talks about how we only work where government and private sector have failed or not deciding to, focus attention. But, I think that, optimistically now, that's not necessarily the case. So, we're trying to land this ship. We only have a year and a half left, but there will be some serious money going out the door, and hopefully that will scale some projects to the next level so that they can really use that to grow their businesses quickly.
One of the things I was sort of mentioning to you earlier was this idea of a vertically integrated nonprofit, right? And sort of this idea of if you're seeding things and you're allocating money to one, you had talked about the 4 different carbon removal strategies and sort of the sectors that you're talking about, the areas. And sort of I'm curious about y'all's idea of if this idea is great and we need to sort of allocate money just directly here, is that okay? Or do we have to sort of think about, the broader, sort of funding mechanism?
I think there's a few underlying questions in there.
Sure.
Part of it is getting at maybe how we think about designing and structuring the prize, which is something we did a lot of research and consultation on early on. Probably with a lot of you in this room might have been at that early workshop we did back in 2018, but making the decision to keep it open across all carbon removal pathways. There were a lot of conversations around should this be a DAC-only prize. We decided to keep all pathways in the running because we also were nervous about trying to anoint some silver bullet in the carbon removal space, which was not our intention. Our intention was really to launch as many new companies into the space as possible across all of the different pathways so that we could start to see the results from real demonstrations being fielded, which is where we need to be right now. Getting as many 1,000-ton plants up and running as quickly as possible is a joint, community ecosystem goal right now. We really need that to happen. And then part of it was about picking certain winners or how they're maybe complementary to each other.
Yeah.
And I think, we were careful to think about, there is a single winner receiving a $50 million prize, which will be critical, hopefully, to scaling that company. But we also have a runners-up pool for 3 additional companies to receive the remaining $30 million in the outstanding prize purses. And we hope that those awards will be catalytic to those companies as well. And we wanted that to also reflect having more than one single solution because we know that this is a massive problem and it's going to require many companies to grow quickly. And so, we're not just kind of putting our thumb on the scale with any companies in that way. There's a whole kind of structure to the evaluation criteria, and we have an external panel of independent judges that do the review based on all the data and the verification site visits and everything like that. And that will all go into the judging process, and they'll look across criteria that include everything from, the operational performance of the demonstration itself, which is first and foremost what we care about at XPRIZE because we're a demonstration competition. It's not an ideas competition, so you actually have to remove the carbon.
Right.
And then we're looking at other factors alongside that as well.
I'm curious, we had a panel earlier today about the geographic distribution and sort of the regionality of DAC sites and sort of the idea of thinking about different technologies that are going to work regionally, thinking about sort of the different implications of this technology to the local community. I'm curious again about the conversations y'all are having, because when you think about seeding these sorts of ideas, you have to, I imagine, think about exactly where they're going to go.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of the proposal that all of the companies need to explain, like, where is your demonstration site? Why did you choose that? What is valuable about locating in a certain city, in a certain geographic formation, and what a geologic formation, and why are you choosing to build at this scale there versus, megaton versus gigaton? And we're looking at, like, folks' scale-up trajectory, but also it's very important for us to think about the community impacts as well. So it's not just about, is the system working? It's like, how are you going to work with communities there? And we'll, I'm sure, talk a little bit more about that. But, all of these come together so that we can look holistically at, the potential of a given company's trajectory.
Well, even I live in Texas, and I go out to the Permian Basin all the time, right? And sort of there was a big idea about, if and when we start shutting down oil and gas out in the Permian, wind is going to be there. We're going to have to be able to sort of allocate that workforce to take over those jobs. I'm curious again about y'all in this space and sort of the human capital that's needed. Again, I imagine that has to go into the consideration of allocating funds to these projects.
Yeah, so all of the companies are required to answer kind of a set of questions about responsible deployment and community engagement and environmental justice. We have made this a big priority, similar to DOE and Jen's comments earlier about this needing to be part of the consideration now. And so we'll be releasing a new white paper actually too, to kind of give background about why we chose the questions we chose and how that kind of plays into the decision making. But all of these things are critical to be thinking about now, and it needs to be part of a company's culture at this moment, because it's only going to get more challenging as we grow, as new funding sources become possible. Like, what are your positions about a lot of different things, but making sure that the communities you're working in are front and center are going to be critical to having the social license to scale and being able to move your projects forward. There are so many risks with projects being stopped because of communities that don't support it. And so part of that process is educating them. Part of that process is working with them, bringing them into your team in any capacity that you can, hire local staff, but also local advisors to understand like what the community challenges are, what past harms have they experienced from other industry being located nearby in their backyard, because unfortunately the same communities are getting hit over and over again. And what benefits might your project be able to bring? In addition to jobs, it's not just about the number of jobs, the quality of jobs, are they the right fit, and what other benefits might you be able to support in that community to help build more of a supportive relationship.
And also, yeah, the concern about are we bringing different harms? That sort of those conversations I know are happening all the time. What about the evolution of the conversation? You had talked about sort of starting in 2018, and you were showing sort of the needs of companies. I imagine in 2018, even the conversations y'all were having about what these needs were going to be to today, when you talk about the different, concerns or the different sort of the evolution of that conversation about these are the things that these startup companies need. Tell me. I mean, I'm sure they're very different 5 years on.
I think there are new, different concerns, but also the old ones still stand because we're seeing companies now across the full range of maturity. And so you have folks that are brand new, and that's similar to what we saw. Like, everybody was brand new, 5 years ago and just getting started. And so people were looking for like that first check, that first, seed round or grant, non-dilutive funding that they could get their hands on so that they could start, to at least build a proof of concept. Now we're seeing a lot of companies that have done that, and they need, scaling funding to start building demonstrations. And so funding is going to continue to be a huge piece of the puzzle, but it will evolve, as the conversation has been showing today. And, the policy landscape is also critical. We're seeing, a lot of momentum, and we've seen so much progress in recent years and things like 45Q and the DAC hubs and, the federal government purchasing. That's amazing. That's the kind of stuff we need to see more of. And it's, just because it exists doesn't mean it's enough, but it also, we're on a good trajectory. But that's here in the U.S., all of the other, we have companies from all over the world in our cohort, and I think folks that are in other countries are like, okay, well, do we move to the U.S.? Do we advocate for this in our countries? I mean, we're seeing a lot of efforts, in Canada and Europe, and people trying to push policies forward to make more of an enabling environment in those spaces. But, it will continue to be a need as we scale.
And like you said, too, access to capital, access to funding, I imagine any place we had talked about, we had a panel talking about sort of that idea in Kenya and sort of the idea of how do we get that money where it needs to go and help that community. I'm also curious, because we've been talking a lot about, and I think most of the folks in the room would agree, look, the technology right now is really expensive. And so figuring out and sort of thinking about the scalability when you're thinking about the seed money that needs to happen right now, and also thinking about, well, we're hoping that these costs are going to come down. So sort of thinking about the allocation and the financing, I guess you start with the seed money and then you hope that it gets cheaper. Is that sort of the idea?
Yeah, I mean, all of these companies are going to need to come down the cost curve,
Sure.
and so we're going to see that trajectory across the board. I also should have mentioned before, talent is
Sure.
a huge thing that I think we're seeing a bit of an inflection point right now, because all of these companies are starting to scale at the same time, and they need so many of the same skills and expertise. So really trying to encourage new people to come into the field across all industries, because we know that skills needed to run a business are diverse, and so we're going to have to convince people to come work in carbon removal with us, but also get more young people studying this in schools so that we'll have a new talent pipeline coming out. But yeah, that they're all going to be coming down the cost curve. And the financing challenges are really going to continue to evolve as companies get to the next tranches. The needs are different. The burden of proof and the risk profiles and all of these things are also changing. So, it's going to become higher stakes as companies get to the next stage. I mean, unfortunately, there will be winners and losers
Sure.
at some point. We're still in this massive growth, everything needs to be tried stage. I don't know how long that's going to last, but eventually, we're not going to be able to have that many different probably carbon removal companies, although maybe we could. We're going to have to see how the scaling works for companies, but a lot of capital is sitting on the sidelines too, just kind of waiting to see once we have results from these early pilots from other companies, before they jump in and, have bankable contracts like we were talking about earlier with Microsoft.
You talked about that, sort of cultivating that workforce. Is that going to come from, I imagine, academic institutions, but at the same time, these small businesses? Is there a role for nonprofits and a nonprofit like XPRIZE to sort of help foster that education of this new workforce, or is that more sort of, academic institutions? And I'm just curious about sort of how does a nonprofit like yours think about we gotta have these people doing this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I don't know that we're necessarily in the business of retooling
Sure.
people in that way, but I think, part of it comes from people learning about this space, knowing that there's a need, and seeing that there are jobs that are available that are good paying and interesting to people. So, having more mechanisms to promote that and get the word out, and so having more consolidated talent pipelines that exist, or there's definitely a need for that. And then having, more kind of interesting excitement for young people,
Sure.
so that they see oh, this is something I want to be a part of. I see a career here. And so having the first handful of really successful DAC and carbon removal companies will be key in that, because they'll get media, they'll get good press, they'll be like, this is an inspiring career path for me. And so trying to figure out how to put a spotlight on those things, make it seem cool and interesting and, a good place for new people.
One of the questions I feel like I'm going to be asking a whole lot of folks when we go over to the happy hour is there something today, I mean, I saw you watching the video, I'm curious about, is there something that stood out to you that you sort of picked up on today that you maybe necessarily didn't know about DAC or didn't know sort of about the space, or is it just sort of, are you trying to absorb all you can right now?
I mean, I guess a little bit of both. I think we're all learning all the time. Every time there's a new DAC company in the room,
Sure.
I feel like I learn a bit from, the direction they're trying to go. I think it's helpful to see all of the different perspectives coming together. We have the suppliers, we have the buyers, we have the investors, we have government. All of these folks bring something different and useful to the table. So I'm just trying to, absorb all of that information as well. It was interesting to see the IEA presentation.
Sure.
I think, the global kind of momentum around this being, an area that we really need to get behind, but also it's not without controversy. And a lot of people in this room are also submitting letters and trying to push the needle. So that is not going to go away. And even though we're seeing a lot of growth, there's still a lot of work to do.
Perfect. XPRIZE's Nikki Batchelor, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.